Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Itchon. Our guest this week is PRI's Chairman of the Board, Clark Judge. When he's not busy being chairman of PRI, Clark is a founder and managing director of the White House Writers Group, a strategic communications firm based in Washington, D.C. I met Clark when I was a White House intern, and he was Vice President George H.W. Bush's chief speechwriter. Not long after, he became one of President Reagan's speechwriters. In this episode, Tim and I, PRI's Director of Communications, and I chat with Clark Judge on the November election results and what we can expect from the future of free market reforms. Will a divided Congress mean gridlock, more investigations, and the end of President Trump's agenda? With such a polarized political environment, can anything get done? Tim and I chat with Clark Judge at our headquarters here in San Francisco. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Next Round with PRI, Clark.
Oh, thank you.
So let's recap. As of this recording, the GOP retained the Senate, and the House lost about more than 30 seats to the Dems. And in California, we have a new governor, and the Democrats are poised to regain their supermajority in the Senate and retain it in the Assembly. How would you characterize this campaign season?
Look, California really hasn't changed. The margins in the legislature were already close to supermajority if they weren't. They were a little bit for a while, then not for a while and all. And the governor was Governor Brown, who's a Democrat. I mean, have we got a more leftist Democrat, one who has managed to ruin a whole city and is now taking on a state? Well, I guess you could say so, but it's not that big a change. I did a lot of radio during this season, and I'd get this kind of question prospectively rather than retrospectively. And you have to go to the prognosticators who are becoming more and more sophisticated, not more and more accurate, but they've got elaborate mathematical models, and makes your head hurt. But and every one of them was like this, we have this bell curve or something. It goes, this was like Nate Silver, one of the more famous ones. It goes from a 10% chance of the Democrats picking up 60 seats to a 10% chance of them losing, I don't know how many seats, not losing seats, but of them not taking over the House. I mean, at that point, you've got that kind of a spread. What does it tell you? Well, you have to look at the center of the bell curve. But with all of them, which in his case was reasonably close to where things turned out. But with all of them, there was a caveat. The caveat was, what if we're off 3 or 4 points? And which is what happened last time for a lot of them. And I was reading one a few days before the election, and it was very sophisticated, very much on the left, the people who did it. And very sophisticated, very well. It looked to me very well done. And they came up with their prediction and then said, but there could be a 3 to 4% Republican vote, at which point the Democrats have a horrible night. So this whole season was like trying to balance when you're on a these balls and the circus sort of things. You have ball and a platform on it, and then you try to balance. Except it wasn't a ball; it was a pin, and you were both sides were trying to balance, and nobody knew which way it would come out. And the way it came out was everybody won and everybody lost. The Republicans lost the House, but they picked up seats, we think, unless they're stolen from them, in the Senate. Well, which would you rather have, the House or the Senate? If you're trying to, I think there's no question you'd rather have the Senate. So everybody won and everybody lost unless the winners of the Senate get it stolen from them, which is very possible.
The party in power historically loses seats in Congress in the first midterm election. So given the results, do you think that what happened on election night is really history taking its usual course, or do you think there are other circumstances that explain the Democrats' gains over the GOP?
Well, as I said, they won. The Democrats won and lost, and the Republicans won and lost. But I think in the House side, probably the biggest single factor was the large number of Republican resignations, the large number of Republicans, what was it, 41, who decided not to run again. What was that? I mean, these were people who had safe seats. What did we see from the special elections? Well, what we saw is what we know about every congressional district almost in the country. Even the super safe ones have this happen in the primaries. The incumbent has spent a lot of years after a tough first race in building up his creds in his district, and he's made sure that everybody's getting serviced well. He's made sure he's come back, and he's very visible. And by the end of his first term, his or her seat is their margins are going to be bigger and pretty secure. By the end of the fourth or fifth term, they're really secure, and the amount of serious challenge has dropped away. And then, 10 terms in or whatever, which was more or less what it was for these guys who we had the special elections for, and for that 41, they decide to retire or something happens. But they generally decide to retire, and all of a sudden you're back to square one. And if you've got a super safe seat, then the tough election is in the primary. And if you have a competitive seat, at least theoretically competitive, you may not have had a competitive election in your whole time since your first race. But now the next guy or next woman who stands there, or women or men, they have a tough race, and whoever comes out on top then goes through that cycle all over again. So besides the resignations, the other big thing is the vast amount of money the Democrats had to throw at this thing. Michael Bloomberg came in and threw millions of dollars in. I guess George Soros did. Who knows? But this was the billionaire's race on the Democrat side. And the candidates were less important than the check writers. We haven't really ever seen anything like that. A small number of super wealthy sources. Both parties have their very wealthy people, but they haven't dominated in the strategy in the way this one did. That was another big change this time.
So let's tip our hats to Dana Rohrabacher from the 48th District. He served for 30 years in the House representing parts of Orange County. He is a friend of both of ours since speechwriting days with the Reagan administration. It was one of these seats that was at risk in California, thanks in part to changing demographics from that district. So as of this recording, his seat hangs in the balance. In your view, what's the hallmark of Dana's tenure in the House?
Well, Dana is very, very committed. He has a tremendous dedication to the cause of freedom, whether it's abroad or here in the United States. He's got his libertarian streak, and so he's been an advocate for cannabis and laws being eased, and for in that area. But he also has a tremendous strategic sense, and I don't mean that in the narrow political way, but in a sense of the strategic threats and to the United States and how to respond to them. Now, I know in the campaign he took a lot of heat over Russia and his cultivation of the Russian government. I know the reason for that, and it was very simple. He told me years ago, we have a real problem. We're up against the Chinese, who he regarded as the biggest threat to the United States. We're up against the Islamicists, who he regarded as the second biggest. And we're up against the Russians. And that's at least one too many to take on all at once. And so he's tried to do what he could to take the Russians off the board and have some sort of an alliance. Now, Putin, particularly in the last 4, 5, or 6 years, hasn't cooperated at all. On the other hand, I've had somebody who's senior in a foreign government say that before Putin went in Crimea, that the U.S. government was putting a lot of pressure on this, under the Obama administration, on this particular government, this person's government, to get close to Putin. And they kept saying, well, is this really a good idea? And the Obama people were extremely, they were putting a lot of pressure on. And so finally these people said, okay, if you say so. And as soon as Putin went into Crimea, they were saying, why are you close to that guy? Well, you told us to be there. I will say that in this particular case, the relationship between the United States and that government deteriorated quickly because the people who ran that government were started to think, well, the Americans make us do things we think are unwise, and then they tell us afterwards, when what we warned about happens, that things aren't, why are you doing it? It's so unwise. Well, you made us do it. So Dana has foreseen these kinds of challenges to the United States, and he was trying to get the Russians in a place where, or urge us to get the Russians into a place where they couldn't be as much of a threat, that we had a bit of an alliance, and that they would take their heat off of the countries that border them. It didn't work, but it was an important strategic insight, and it was a good thing to try, even if it didn't work.
So on the campaign trail and in recent weeks, President Trump has been throwing out a lot of ideas that he'd like to pursue in the second half of his first term. He's talked about the so-called tax cut 2.0. He's talked about rolling back parts of Obamacare. Of course, he's talked about the wall and even immigration reform. So given this new makeup of the House, it's probably not going out on a limb to say that legislative gridlock will probably thwart any of these ideas. What do you think? Is there anything that Trump can really accomplish, or does this gridlock set him up to just train his rhetorical fire toward the 2020 campaign?
There's a lot that could be accomplished. Whether it will be or not is a big question. You mentioned middle-class tax cut. Isn't that what the Democrats have been looking for a long time? Infrastructure program. Isn't that what the Democrats have been looking for a long time? Problem here is what we've been seeing all along, what we saw in the Kavanaugh hearing. The Democrats in Congress are driven by the most extreme elements in their party, and those elements are, if Trump is for it, they're against it. I'm not very, I know they were making lots of noises during the campaign about not wanting to be some of their candidates. They wouldn't vote for Pelosi. They wouldn't be for impeachment and all that. If an impeachment resolution doesn't go through the House Judiciary Committee very early on, I'll be pretty surprised. So I think this is what we've got right now is a group running the Democratic Party that is about as angry and extreme as we've ever seen in a political party, at least in the 20th century, and the 21st. So I think that this is going to be a tough road. At the same time, one of the things he can do is find some way, if he can, to offer them deals that are consistent with the middle ground between the two parties, and make a decision. Will they do something for the country, or will they let their inner angry child scream and cry and kick and be nasty, and my guess is that that's the way they'll go. But if they don't, there might be some things he can do.
In the end, do you think President Trump helped or hurt Republican candidates across the country?
I think there's no question that he was responsible for the Republican advances. This election was going to be about him anyway. There was people say, oh, you didn't have to go in. Well, you had to go in. There was no question but that the Democrats were going to make this election about him, and the press was going to follow along like a trained puppy, and he was going to be the center, and he was going to. They would try to define him even more than the press has tried so far, and they have. But so he had to take it on, and he did it very effectively. One of his great talents is how to punch through the screen that the press wants to throw up around him, the cloud of his own accusations and interpreting everything to his disadvantage. So I think he effectively defined issues in the larger constituencies, which is to say states, entire states. There may not have been as much room to do that in congressional districts because they were being smaller. They tended to be a little more homogeneous, and so we talk about not the kind of broad mix of rural, urban, suburban, and rural that you necessarily have in basically every single state. But we talk about the suburban vote or the rural vote. Congressional districts are more homogeneous, and in those that were moving against him, in every place there was a move, both of populations, both groups, both before him, towards him, and the Republicans, and against him and the Republicans, and they tended to cross parties. I mean, he was elected. The margin of his victory in the states that gave him the election was provided by people who had voted for Barack Obama in 2012 and voted for him in 2016. Well, there wasn't as when you got down to the congressional district level, you got one or another. Those who were moving against him or those who were moving towards him. And a lot of those seats that were lost, if they to the degree that the losses were a result not of Republicans, longtime incumbents leaving, and not as a result of $20 million being thrown in against a candidate who had maybe never had to raise more than $1 million. To that extent, the homogeneous, the small nature, the House just was a harder sell in a polarized country.
So in 2016, there was always a question in the back of conservatives' minds about how conservative was Donald Trump. And if you look at his positions on trade and drug pricing and the inability to rein in federal spending, these are things that are keeping some free market policy types like us up at night. So as someone who prides himself on the art of the deal, do you think that Trump might actually deal with the Democrats, resulting in big spending projects like infrastructure?
Well, I think he certainly will try to. I don't think he's going to have a willing counterparty in this. I don't think we may be surprised, but the head of the Democratic Judiciary Committee in the House has already said he's going to file for impeachment on the first day. You've got a bunch of others who are saying similar things. After pledging that Nancy Pelosi wasn't going to be Speaker, now it looks like she's going to be Speaker. She certainly made it sound as though that's her agenda, and there are a lot of people lined up behind her. So I think there's a question of whether there's anybody to deal with. We'll have to see about that. But I'm going to take a little bit of push back a little bit about your characterization of his positions. How about trade? Well, everybody says he's protectionist. In the campaign, he said, yeah, I'm taking these positions, but I'm a free trader, which everybody, certainly the press, sort of waved off as, yeah, tell us more about that, right? Yeah, guy. No, but then we get to NAFTA. What does he do? He addresses some big issues with Mexico, a few issues that are important with Canada, and you come out with something. Some people think it's worse, some people think it's better, but it's no more or less free trade than NAFTA was. How about with the Europeans? Yeah, he's got all the stuff going on with the Europeans. Then the head of the European Union comes over, and what do you get? A move towards broad reduction of trade barriers on both sides. My feeling is he's willing to take all sorts of positions that are extremely threatening to a counterparty, and then negotiate to a place that is better for both parties than where it was. And clearly he thought that, well, I'll tell you one thing about NAFTA. I was a supporter of NAFTA when it was passed. The White House Writers Group, which I head, was very much involved in that and some elements of trade policy in that time and advocating for it. But I have been told that NAFTA, which is to say the document, the treaty, is 3 feet high. Now, a lot can be said about that, but what you can't say is that that's free trade. It's managed trade. And his basic position has been that if you have managed trade, it's not being managed very well. And so he broke a little China, not to have a pun there, but he broke a little China, and he's got looks on the way to a better deal with for both sides, but certainly a freer trade deal with the Europeans. Mixed bag, but from some perspectives, freer with the Mexicans and the Canadians. And then the question is, where do you go with the Chinese? And everybody agrees they're a problem, but what does he get out of having got things straightened out with the Europeans and a little better with the Europeans and and North America? Well, he gets a couple of allies to line up with him. So I think there's a lot more than in this than meets the eye, and much more in the line with our conservative free market policies. Much more.
You alluded to investigations earlier. Now that the Democrats have the House, do you think we'll see more investigations and even a possible impeachment?
Yes. I mean, I think that's what the country voted for in many respects was 2 years of fighting. I'd like to see it be different, but I think that's what we've got.
Well, speaking of fighting, let's dive into the 2020 presidential race, since really it's never too early to start talking about the next election. So,
wait a minute. Why not just cut to the chase? Let's go to the 2024 election.
Yes. Exactly. Well, some of the people we're going to talk about here could be around for that election too. So we've got what some might call rising stars here in California. We have Senator Kamala Harris. We have Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti. We have billionaire Tom Steyer. Yesterday we learned Congressman Eric Swalwell from here in the Bay Area might be running for president, and even our own Oprah. So can any of these folks or anyone else on the list that we haven't named challenge the Donald?
Well, first of all, I thought Oprah was out of Chicago.
No, she's got a 45-acre property in Montecito called the Promised Land.
Actually, let's talk about a few things with this. Celebrity clearly is somewhat helpful in this age because of the need to get just to get known. But Democrats have a problem, several problems. It doesn't look like that necessarily, but they do. First, they've alienated a lot of their traditional base. They think they're on the right side of demography. I'm not sure they're right about that. But they, and it's very possible, I know you can see that Trump has been playing to at least split some portion of African Americans and Latinos away. It wasn't going to happen in an off term, but it might happen in a presidential. I'm sure the Democrats are aware of that, and they'll do their normal stuff of throwing charges of racism and all. But I'm not sure that might not work. You don't need a large portion of either of those votes to break away to totally change the map. But they'll still end up with a large portion of those votes. Maybe not as large as before. The problem for them, and with some of their other votes, is that they tend to be low turnout votes. And this is part of why they make the really obscene claims about what Republicans are going to do, because they're trying to stoke the paranoia of these groups. What does that mean? It means you don't nominate a Tom Steyer. You've got to nominate somebody who will bring those turnouts up. Their hypothesis is it's got to be somebody who's part of those groups. I'm not sure that's actually true, but Kamala Harris is and Oprah obviously is, and there's some others who are. And I would expect that they'll take those on. Of those, you never know. I think somebody who's a congressman or a woman is too far down, hasn't had enough exposure, can't even be sure that they'll carry their own state. And one of the problems with anybody from California is that, I'll say two problems. Number one is you get nothing if you're a Democrat by nominating a Californian. If you can't win California, you might as well hang it up and go home. But if the Democrats can't. The other thing is that California, you don't get anything, and there are a lot of places around the country that the Democrats need to pick up seats, votes from, where California isn't that big an asset for all the reasons we know. So I think that the formula for the Democrats is a non-Californian, probably a non-New Yorker too, who's part of one of those low turnout groups that they hope to energize and get behind them. We'll see, but that's what I think. Where I think the Democrats will find their victories.
Can you throw out some of those names?
I could, but it would be wrong.
What do you think? The one I've been seeing on Twitter a lot this week is the phenomenon continues, Beto O'Rourke running for president.
Oh, give me a break.
So as we concluded, the state remains solidly blue and has become a trendsetter when it comes to left-wing politics. Gavin Newsom has a big budget agenda, including spending on social services, affordable housing, which translates to housing credits and subsidies, and spending on early childhood education. Is California leading the union left, or does the rest of the country see California as a lesson in what not to do?
I don't know that we know just yet about whether it's leading the union left. The union left is having a bad time these days. They may have had some victories. They knocked off Scott Walker, but the both votes and court rulings against their union, public employee union, contributions, those are likely to weaken the union left, because the unions right now, they've lost so much in private sector jobs that they're not that powerful outside of the public sector unions, and the public sector unions only depend almost entirely on the money from basically compulsory dues, which are set in law. So to the extent that that gets weakened, I see California where it won't be weakened anytime soon. Despite the recent Supreme Court opinion, you can be sure that the left is going to find, and the unions are going to find, every possible way to frustrate that opinion, and they'll probably be successful for at least a decade. I see the rest of the country sort of moving in the other direction on these questions. I think with Gavin Newsom, yes, he has a big budget agenda. Now, where does that go? He spends and he spends and he spends. He drives entrepreneurs, which are the heart of the California boom of the last century, out of the state. You might try to start something in the state. As soon as you have an income, you'd better get out, or else you're going to be much less competitive against whoever you have to compete with, who's going to be right behind you. So he does that, and he spends and he spends, and he bankrupts the state, and much more. The state is effectively bankrupt now, but he does it to a point where it's insolvent. You know, it's not just that the what's owed is more than what the state has, but that there's no money. As Margaret Thatcher once said, pretty soon socialists promise everything, and pretty soon they run out of other people's money. Well, California's looking to see how fast you can run out of other people's money, California political leadership. So what happens then? And I think what it must be in the back of the minds of the California left is they go to the federal government and knock on its door. And, you know, we've got all these electoral votes. Well, those electoral votes right now don't go for either, are locked into one party. So that party doesn't really have to play ball, because there's no place else for California to go the way it's voting right now. But the other problem is that the federal government, it's in better shape, but it's not in great shape. And having this sort of big crying baby dropped on its doorstep is not something anybody in Washington outside of California is going to want to. They're not going to want to take it in and nurture it and love it to death. Love it till it's fat and grown and running around the house. They're going to say, maybe you ought to go back where you came from. So and part of the reason for that is that the federal government, let me just throw a number at you. By 2030, and let's see, we're in 2018 now, so that's 22 years. It's 12 years, excuse me. Isn't that's even more depressing. In 12 years. And by that date, according to some very good projections, 100%, I know that number, doesn't require any math. 100% of the federal budget is going to be taken up by Medicare, Social Security, and interest on the national debt. 100%. I said budget? No, wrong. Federal tax collections. So everything else, the Weather Service, the FBI, the military, everything else will have to run on borrowed money. Now, Democrats in Congress and all are hiding from that. And I've got my own suspicions about where the president is going, but at least right now, there's been a big run-up in spending. My thinking is that it's setting the predicate for a big cut, but that's another matter. But this has to stop. We either have to get more revenue or be spending less, and have that big baby dropped on your front door in a basket and take care of it. No, California is going to have to take care of it.
Well, after depressing us with that news, I think we might need a drink. So listeners to our podcast when we did our pre-election show know that I enjoyed a vodka tonic or 3 on election night going through everything. So now I'm looking to change and have a good wine. So you had a great wine recommendation on our last podcast. So we're hoping you might have another for our listeners to try.
Well, actually, I have friends who run a vineyard called White Cliff, and it's White Cliff Vineyard, and their wines are in some of the finest restaurants in New York. And why New York? Because they're in the Hudson Valley. And I know this is California podcast, but we've just gone through that what California's position is, and I can say that there are great California vineyards, but there are some great vineyards elsewhere, and that's actually a lesson California has to learn.
Thanks, Clark. Thanks again to our guest, PRI Chairman Clark Judge. To stay up to date with PRI, go to our website at pacificresearch.org. While you're there, check out our blog, Right by the Bay. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/PacificResearch1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.